Thank you very much, Jonathan, for these opening remarks, and good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this Global Compact on Migration talk. As you've heard, we'll be focusing on migrant smuggling and the complex dynamics that shape this phenomenon. Now, considering the topic, I feel I must begin today's conference on a somber note. We are just 7 days away after the tragic event at sea that claimed the lives of hundreds of children, women, and men in a horrific manner. And amid this tragedy, I would kindly all of us here, to pause for just a few seconds to honor the lives and the memories of all the victims impacted by transnational organized crime. Thank you. My name is Damien Turio, and I lead the Immigration and Border Governance Division at IOM. As a joint effort between UNODC and IOM to advance in the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration, we co-lead the work stream called Ensuring Migrant Protection through strengthened responses to migrant smuggling and increased coordination on its linkages with trafficking in person, all the elements that Jonathan has talked about. This, of course, includes other UN agencies and a number of civil society organizations, such as the Mixed Migration Center, which is joining us today, and the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, to name but a few. I'll be facilitating today's panel discussion and moderating the intervention that will follow. Let me start with a panel discussion. First of all, I'm honored to introduce the following guest speakers for us today. First of all, easier if I call you Samantha.
No, say them both.
All right. I'll pick up the challenge. We'll have Samantha Irikidzai Munudawaho. Thank you. And she joins us from the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section of UNODC. She has solid experience providing technical assistance to member states to develop and update counter-trafficking legislation and policy, provide capacity building assistance to the criminal justice sector, and importantly, establish data collection system and supporting regional intelligence-driven law enforcement operation. We'll also have Roberto, and if you insist, I say we'll also have Roberto Forin, the migration expert, deputy director and acting EU regional manager of the Mixed Migration Center. He's worked with the Mixed Migration Center in conducting extensive research on different aspects and characteristics of human smuggling across different regions and settings. And the aim of such research is to supply the nuance, the empirical evidence that we need, and that is so lacking when we have these polarized policy debates. So we truly look forward to hearing both your views. We will then be honored to have online Ms. Siobhan Mulally, who serves as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons with a focus on women and children. Given her unique standpoint, she will take the floor to share her perspective on the matter. And finally, it's my pleasure to also have John Brandolino, the Director of Division for Treaties Affairs at UNODC, to be closing the talk. And at some point, Jonathan will disappear, and John will come back up. You can go, we can invite John. Now,
this is what we prepared earlier.
Yeah. This is a good trick for you to join. Now, I also want to note that the last time we looked, we had 400 people registered online. And that's representation from our member states, from all over our member states, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, as well as civil society, and of course, UN staff. I hope that we can accommodate all the interventions. And I want to a long list of intervention. And so I'll ask that you stick to the allocated time, and just know that I have a really strong team over there, very strong on time management enforcement, to ensure that all of you have a voice. If you monopolize the voice, others don't get to speak. Let me focus on to the panel discussion. Now, migrant smuggling has become increasingly visible, increasingly in the media attention, as we've seen these days. Yet we suffer from a general lack of data and disaggregated data, as well as sharing mechanism for having this data. That, of course, impacts our policymaking and the capacity of our policymakers to take decisions. For instance, we know that in 2022, the IOM's Missing Migrant Project documented the deaths of almost 7,000 people. the highest death toll recorded since 2016. What we don't know is whether these deaths occurred within the context of smuggling. And this gap has kept governments, border and migration agencies, civil society from fully addressing and preventing the negative impacts driven by the activities of transnational organized groups. And on top of the impact, we also need to address the motivation for the smuggling of migrants. And that's even more complicated because of the multifaceted decision-making process that's associated with smuggling, as well as the diverse actors that we have scattered across the communities and smuggling routes. So I'll come back to some key interlinked area we know, but I'd like to come to the panel discussion specifically and to you, Samantha. Before joining UNODC, you had worked for various human rights organizations. You also have government perspective because you were an admitted attorney of the High Court in South Africa. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from your side some of the key challenges and opportunities you see in terms of implementing the Global Compact for Migration in the context of the smuggling of migrants. And I'm told you need to be 10 centimeters.
At about 10 centimeters. Okay. Thank you very much, Damien, for the opportunity. I am going to speak about 3 challenges in particular because if we speak about all of them, I might not manage to do it in the 10 minutes. But the 3 challenges I'm going to speak about are based on an output, a policy brief that the work stream, the Smuggling of Migrants, Trafficking in Persons work stream, has recently released. Most of you received it together with your invitation, just to give you a bit of a test of what is there. But I think it also really reflects what the challenges are on the ground from various perspectives. First, it's about the definitions and the approaches to migrant smuggling at policy and operational level that are increasingly misaligned with international law and international standards. There is an internationally agreed definition of smuggling of migrants in the Smuggling of Migrants Protocol, which basically says, the person who, in order to get financial or other material benefit, facilitates the irregular entry of a person into a country that they're not a citizen or a resident of, is to be considered a smuggler. And you'd think since the Smuggling of Migrants Protocol has 151 state parties by now, and we have the Global Compact on Migration setting out the concrete measures for implementation, that would all be speaking the same language globally, but it seems not to be the case. There are countries, or there are several situations where there's a bit of confusion, and smuggling of migrants is conflated with other phenomena. I think most notoriously irregular migration, because for smuggling of migrants, there needs to be a third party that facilitates it. And the whole point is to get some kind of a profit or material benefit. A person who's just irregularly traveling is not a smuggler, or, but these things get convoluted in practice a lot. And there's also quite a lot of conflation with trafficking in persons. I think many of you, when you watch the news, they actually use them interchangeably. Like the people were being smuggled by the traffickers, and in a way that makes the response complicated, because these are distinct phenomena which have different responses that apply to them. With trafficking in persons, there'd be exploitation that comes into play, and the response is quite different to that. Then, outside of the ones who might conflate out of confusion, there's also some who make a policy decision to only partially criminalize smuggling of migrants under the international definition. And how they usually do this is to drop the requirement of profit and material benefit. Then that becomes a problem because it casts the net really wide. The facilitation of irregular migration can happen for purely altruistic reasons. It could be people helping refugees to reach safety. It could be charity organizations, it could be family members. These are not the people that the protocol is trying to go after. And as a result, the impact is one that might be contrary to the protocol, because Article 19 of the protocol particularly protects certain groups of people. It protects people who are protected under the Refugee Convention. It upholds international human rights. It upholds international humanitarian law. I think because I'll do my challenges and infuse the opportunity in there as well so that my answer is not too long. But for me, the opportunity in there is what if countries could use the counter-smuggling measures as per the protocol and the Global Compact on Migration for their original intended purpose, which was more as a criminal justice tool to clamp down on organized crime and not something to criminalize migration. The second challenge I'm going to go into is about data, that there's quite a lot of gaps in knowledge, whether qualitative or quantitative data on smuggling of migrants. It's like fighting a giant that you can't define. It's really difficult. There's research out there and there are studies out there about who the smugglers are, what their modus operandi, but usually they concentrate on a specific region. Like there's quite a lot on what's happening in the Mediterranean, but that doesn't mean smuggling is only happening in the Mediterranean. What does it look like elsewhere in the world? And as a result, decisions, policy decisions, and decisions about allocation of funding get determined by the available evidence and data. So this is one big challenge. And globally, we don't yet have an equivalent of an annual global report on smuggling of migrants. So there are some estimates that people draw from the arrivals that are migrants who arrive safely, but many of them remain unaccounted for, and it's difficult to quantify the loss of life that happens during the process of smuggling. Because this is an area where there's really not as much data, where there's a lot of room to develop, I think there's an opportunity there to strengthen our research and data collection efforts when it comes to smuggling of migrants, so that we can have evidence-based responses, and also to promote sharing of this kind of data among source, transit, and destination countries. And within our work stream, this is one of the priorities that we have. Next output outside this knowledge paper will be around sharing of data, how to do that more effectively globally. The last challenge I'm going to talk about is addressing abuses against smuggled migrants. Jonathan mentioned earlier that people who are smuggled are abused, and it's true. We all know this. They're subjected to rape, kidnapping, extortion. People who actually started off being smuggled can end up being trafficked as well. Like there's all these crimes that are committed against them, and which are crimes anyway in our countries with or without a smuggling law. But you find that access to justice for them is really rarely ever happens, let alone reparations, compensation for any harm they would have suffered. Currently, within the Global Compact on Migration, especially after the International Migration Review Forum and its progress declaration, there is good wording there that creates an opportunity for that creates a basis for designing rights-based approaches, stronger rights-based approaches to addressing migrant smuggling. And it also opens up the possibility of this well-rounded, more holistic conversation about how to combat migrant smuggling, not just through criminal justice responses, but also dealing with some of the root causes of why people turn to migrant smugglers, notably the lack of opportunities to migrate regularly. And there are also specificities, that come with that, like gender, ethnicity, etc., have a particular impact on somebody's choice to use migrant smugglers as opposed to normal migration. You find, for example, in some countries that women, for example, would need support or documentation from a man to be able to leave the country. So yeah, so there's quite a few issues that could be addressed in a comprehensive way. I'll just end, I think Florence, if she will share in the chat with the link to this paper that had more or less these arguments and more. And they're really very interesting ideas that came from there. It's a publication called Mapping the Landscape of Smuggling of Migrants, an overview of key concepts, trends, challenges, and areas for action. It was done by members of the workstream who are UNODC, IOM, UNHCR, Mixed Migration Center, PICAM, Our Journey in Malaysia, and MYCP. At first, when we were conceptualizing it, we thought we would just be bringing together the collective knowledge that there is about migrant smuggling. But because of, I think, the diversity and the richness that is in the group of having, well, UN agencies with the way we talk and migrant voices and youth voices, there really is quite a thought-provoking piece. So I really encourage that we take time to read it. At UNODC, we are very excited about it, and I'm just going to embarrass John a little bit and really thank him for coming to support and witness this in person. We know that he's, it's a sacrifice for him to come, so thank you very much, John, for that. And also, IOM, the co-leads, really I know it sounds like a vote of thanks now, right? But thank you so much for all the footwork.
We'll stop being UN and we'll focus now on what civil society is able to do, which is also really, really
because the UN just talks and talks.
I heard three things, issues of definition, issues of data gaps, issue of access to justice specifically. Now, I did have a question for Roberto specifically on that. I mentioned beforehand your flagship data collection program, the 4MI, that has reached out to over 85,000 refugees, 85,000 migrants since 2014, and that included questions on their interaction with smugglers specifically. You've also discussed with smugglers specifically, right? And as such, maybe let's get to the point. Who are the smugglers? What did you find out from all of this? And to some extent, how do you address the issue of corruption? How does the issue of corruption come into that specifically?
Thank you. Close enough.
8 centimeters, they said.
Okay, now it's better. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the question that might seem easy and simple question, who is a smuggler, but the right is that they are not that simple. They are quite complex answer to simple question, and this complexity, I think, is very much at the heart of some of the challenges that anti-smuggling responses are facing today. Probably the most important problem that exists is that where people stand in the migration debate determine how they will answer to this question. Some see all smugglers as evil, perpetrator of horrible human rights violation, while others seem to be seeing them mostly as a benign travel agents and service provider. And I think it's fair to say that the government probably belong majority to the first group, while civil society is arguably a majority in the second. It is a fact that human smuggling is often accompanied by violent and exploitative practices that has been mentioned by all the speakers so far, by you, Sam, and by the others, and it shows that there is an obvious blatant disregard for fundamental human rights. And then the example of people dying in the Mediterranean Sea is obviously a very important one. There is the conflation, not the conflation, there is the fact that in some instances, while it is important to maintain the difference between smuggling and trafficking when it's possible, in some occasions, this distinction is just obsolete, using the word of Vincent Cochetel recently from UNHCR. But on the other side, in many occasions, smugglers are, as a matter of fact, the only option refugees and migrants have to cross border and to find safety. Many smugglers, for a fee, provide exactly the services without any violence, without exploiting their clients, as you mentioned, Sam. So the reality is that the answer to who is a smuggler is much more complex than might look like. As smugglers at the same time represent an opportunity and a great risk. And this might sound theoretical or a discussion of a principle, but is actually a very concrete and pragmatic one. And again, looking at what you mentioned at the beginning, the last shipwreck, and by the way, having to refer to the death of hundreds of people as the last of, is in itself heartbreaking, to say the least. So I'm sure that every single individual involved in that shipwreck, including those that are now in the bottom of the sea, they are considering the people that put up to 750 people, according to the evidence we have, on a boat that could accommodate 100, stacking people all over in the boat and leading to the catastrophic incident. They consider them as being evil perpetrator of horrible abuses, and we all agree that they should be spending their life in jail. But on the other hand, as we are seeing today in the media, in very good reports that are coming out, for many of the people that they are currently missing, this was the only option they had to get out of harm, violence and persecution, to flee extreme poverty, or simply lack for a better life. So, in short, to them, smugglers are at the same time, as I said at the beginning, a deadly threat and a unique opportunity. Now, circling back to the question about our data, this is exactly what our FORMI data is telling us. If we look at all the data we've been collecting over years, and we're speaking about almost 60,000 interviews, most survey respondents state that smugglers help them to achieve their goal of migrating to another country, while at the same time, the same respondent frequently see them as the primary perpetrator of protection violation. So, where this is going to lead us, also, what is the impact on migration policy? How this relate to existence of data and knowledge, also something that you touch upon, Sam. So if the discussion on smuggling, who is a smuggler, is based on opinions and where someone stands in the debate and not on fact and evidence, then of course this has consequences for the responses, because simplistic narrative not based on evidence lead to inadequate responses. We know that often government policies and public rhetoric increasingly focus on the violent nature of human smuggling, while presenting the war against smuggling to the public as the silver bullet to reduce irregular migration. This ignores the complex nature of smuggling that I mentioned earlier, and the diverse nature of the smuggling activity, which can vary between countries and route. And it's also risk, I think you mentioned this, Sam, to extend the notion of criminality to refugees and migrants themselves. On the other hand, thinking that the simple availability of legal pathways will at once make disappear the demand for human smuggling is also a bit naive. And here, though, I like to just, since we're speaking about that and circling back there, give one example, which is based on the response to the Ukrainian crisis. We have been interviewing 1,600 people who fled Ukraine in Warsaw, Bern, and Berlin, including approximately 200 non-Ukrainians over the last 6 months. On average, the incidence of use of smuggler is approximately 5%, meaning 80 people out of 1,600 that we interview had to pay someone to illegally cross the border. Now, if we compare this with the Afghan that we interviewed in 21 and 22, for instance, in Greece, the difference is really striking. Out of 943 Afghan we interviewed, only one did not use multiple smuggler or was smuggled to enter EU. And so, if we have to look at the data and look at the evidence and link that to anti-smuggling, I think that this is telling us that if there is one thing that seems to be at least contributing to attack or to have an impact on the demand for smuggling, and therefore on breaking the business model of smugglers, something that we hear very often, that thing is clear, is the availability of legal pathways, which does contribute. It's not silver bullet in itself, but does have an impact. If I can, in 2 minutes, the corruption. Yeah, I mean, simply said, I don't think that the phenomenon of human smuggling could be understood without looking at the role of corruption and inclusion of state officials, simply said. And also the abuses that are perpetrated against refugees and migrants in the context of smuggling often occur thanks to the impunity and the involvement of collusion of state officials. I know that we have a few examples. Libya is a very glaring one. So here I would like to give you some data from my interviews. In this case, interviews we conducted in West and North Africa in 21. We conducted approximately 6,500 survey with refugees and migrants, and as you mentioned earlier, also interview with smugglers, approximately 280, actually not approximately 280. So from this data, 58% of all refugees and migrants surveyed reported contact with state officials, and 82% of them said that they had to pay a gift to state officials during the journey. 59% of these officials were police at the border. When we moved to smugglers, more than half of the smugglers we interviewed said that they have contact with state officials to facilitate human smuggling, so to operate. When asked with state officials, the majority mentioned the police and border officials. So while it's only an example, I think it is a good example when you look at data and evidence about the role of state officials in allowing smuggling. And so I would like to perhaps end this saying, yes, there is an issue, I think, as I mentioned earlier, about availability of data and knowledge, but I think there is even a bigger issue about how this existing data and knowledge is actually used today to shape the response to the phenomenon of human smuggling. Thank you.
Thanks for this when you started at looking at the issue of definition, which I think joins what you have said specifically, but I kind of summarized it as, had the boat made it, maybe the people who had smuggled these individuals would have been considered heroes by the people who would have made it to the other side. Yeah? So but fluctuates rapidly. On the issue of data, of course, clearly, you're also pinpointing the importance of data. And while legal pathway may not be a silver bullet, as you said, clearly there is evidence that in the absence of legal pathway, the use of smugglers will increase specifically. And then it's also how you use that data for your policy making. If you have great legislation, great policies, but you don't look at the underlying factors, which is both the migrants and the smugglers have linked with law enforcement and are making gifts, then you can have the best policies you want in the world, but you're not addressing the core issue specifically. I'm reminded by the moderator that my role is to keep everyone on time. So I'd like to stop the panel now. We'll have opportunities for reaction later on, and also now I seek the perspective from Siobhan Mullally, if we can get her online, to have her perspective on what she has heard now, and also possibly see the link with some of the work on trafficking that she's working on.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope that you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join. And I just want to reiterate also the comments made by the chair with regard to the recent horrific loss of life in the Pylos disaster, and to reinforce and emphasize the need for urgent and effective investigations and accountability in relation to all those responsible for the loss of life. I want to speak very briefly, and my mandate is specifically with regard to trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And as is noted in the policy brief for today's meeting, and also in the progress declaration from the International Migration Review Forum, it is important to distinguish between smuggling and trafficking. And the key distinction, of course, relates to the question of consent and the person becoming a victim of trafficking because of the lack of consent. And I just want to highlight that requirement is not relevant with regard to a child, and a child is anyone under the age of 18. So with regard to a child, it is not necessary to establish means such as coercion or use of force or deception. It's necessary only to have the act and the purpose of exploitation. And it's not necessary that the exploitation as such has occurred. And consent is always irrelevant. And unfortunately, I think in the context of migration, too often children are treated, particularly adolescents, both boys and girls, but perhaps particularly boys, are treated more like adults, and so are more likely not to be identified as victims of trafficking and instead to be punished or prosecuted. And that adultification, as it is known, is really important for us to continue to address, particularly in the context of the right to equal treatment, to non-discrimination in international law, and the need to recognize that racism and xenophobia underpin our failures to ensure protection of those who are victims of trafficking. What I also want to note, and as is highlighted, of course, in the policy brief, in the Global Compact on Migration and in the Progress Declaration, is that smuggling may be intertwined. A person who is being smuggled may at some point become a victim of trafficking because of changes in the situation. So although they may initially have consented, prior consent does not mean that at a later time or in transit, they become victims of trafficking. And linked to that, I think it's critically important, and I think Samantha highlighted also the criminalization of migration, the criminalization of smuggling, but the importance of reiterating and reminding ourselves that with regard to smuggling, in terms of any possibility of a criminal offence, it needs to be linked to financial benefit. And here it's really critically important that we highlight the humanitarian exception and the obligation on states to ensure that that is in place, including to ensure effective access to asylum and international protection. And those obligations and international human rights law, international refugee law, international humanitarian law continue to apply in the context of migration and continue to apply at border crossings. And the obligation of non-discrimination is a peremptory norm of international law. Unfortunately, it is too often honoured in its disregard rather than in its implementation in the context of migration. And here I want to highlight my ongoing work, and I've had really excellent cooperation with UNODC with regard to the principle of non-punishment concerning victims of trafficking, and the importance of recognising the non-punishment principle as it applies in the context of international protection and the rights of refugees, and specifically Article 31 of the 1951 Convention relating to refugees, which includes the principle of non-penalization for persons who are seeking asylum. And in my report, which will be presented to the Human Rights Council next week, where I look specifically at the intersections of trafficking and access to international protection, I've highlighted the importance of the non-punishment principle and non-penalization to the object and purpose of the Refugee Convention. And in a context where we see increasing pushbacks, interceptions at sea, forced returns, and proposals, expanding proposals for transfers of asylum seekers to third countries, to offshore processing centres, and to punish those arriving by irregular means, we need to reiterate both the humanitarian exception with regard to smuggling and also the obligation of non-punishment and non-penalization in the refugee context. And to ensure that we recognize the obligation to identify, assist, and protect victims of trafficking who may initially have been smuggled, and that obligation continues to apply in the context of interceptions at sea, and at border crossings. And it applies without discrimination. And unfortunately, we see limited protection measures and facilities and services being put in place at border crossings, and also particularly in the context of interceptions at sea. And a failure to recognize that that is directly linked to duties of rescue that are triggered wherever there may be credible suspicions that trafficking is occurring. And again, I would emphasize that that applies without exception and on the basis of a principle of non-discrimination. And to conclude, I just want to highlight both from the Progress Declaration and from the Global Compact itself, the commitment to recognizing the gender dimensions of both smuggling and trafficking, to recognize the very specific needs and experiences of women and girls and of men and boys, of LGBTIQ persons, persons of diverse gender identities, and to recognize that we need to move beyond ideal type or stereotyped views of who may be a victim of trafficking, so that in the context of border crossings, migration movements, including in the context of smuggling, that states are meeting their positive obligation to identify victims of trafficking and to go beyond those stereotypes, to recognize that adolescent boys, that men may also be victims of trafficking, and to recognize that persons of diverse gender identities may be discriminated against in the context of seeking protection. And we also need to ensure in all anti-trafficking measures that we ensure the rights of persons with disabilities, and that may include intellectual disability. So again, I would challenge you to think when you're looking at responses to smuggling, and the policy brief reiterates a commitment to rights-based responses, which is a legal obligation on states and a positive obligation on states, to check how inclusive those responses are and whether or not they're compliant with international human rights law, including rights of persons with disabilities. So I look forward to continued discussion on this, to looking at how we can effectively implement the commitments both in Objective 10 of the Global Compact on Migration on eradicating trafficking, and from Objective 9 in looking at human rights-based responses to smuggling. And I think an important opportunity should not be missed this year with regard to the upcoming Global Refugee Forum. And we've talked quite a bit about the need for more cooperation between both processes, the Global Compact on Migration, review processes, progress declarations and implementation, and progress on the Global Refugee Compact, the commitment to fundamental principles of humanity and international solidarity that underpin the Global Refugee Compact. So the forum will take place later this year. I can see some UNHCR colleagues on the call, and I hope that there also the importance of rights-based responses, ensuring effective access to international protection, will be recognized also in the context of developing responses to smuggling. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for those interventions. And indeed, I mean, you've touched about the issue of definition again, which is, I think, a recurrent issue. The issue of criminalization and of punishment, which we have also talked about in our intervention. And I think a reminder to all of us, yes, both of the cooperation between the two compacts, but of the importance of our rights-based approach, which I think is across the line what any agency or any civil society would be pushing for specifically, including our member states. Talking of member states, I'm now going to be opening the floor, and I have a list of member states that have and civil society organizations that have asked for the floor. I need to be a bit focused and remind our member states of the limit of time that they have. And we may hint if if one goes over the allocated 3 to 4 minutes. Let me start with the representative from Egypt, which is Ms. Reham Zaran, who is the Minister Plenipotentiary. The floor is yours.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for giving me the floor. And I would like to share with you some of Egypt's best practices in responding to the crime of smuggling of migrants. First, in Egypt, we tackled the crime of smuggling of migrants, not only from the criminal perspective as a transnational crime, but also from the human rights perspective, as it represents a violation to the basic human rights of the migrants, and also from the developmental perspective, as we all agree that the socioeconomic factors are undeniably key drivers of illegal migration. This crime is also closely linked to the corruption and the money laundering. And based on this vision, Egypt was among the first countries to create an institutional body in charge of setting and coordinating the national policies to combat and prevent illegal migration, which is the National Coordinating Committee for Combating and Preventing Illegal Migration and Trafficking in Persons. The committee was established in 2014. The membership of the committee brings together 30 ministries and human rights national agencies, and it reflects the comprehensive approach Egypt is adopting to combat the crime of illegal migration. Members include the Unit of Combating Money Laundering and the National Authority for Administrative Control to deal with the corruption and the money laundering aspect of the crime. The committee embarked its journey by adopting the National Law on Combating and Preventing Illegal Migration, which was the first in the region of the Middle East and North Africa that defines the crime of migrant smuggling and provides law enforcement agencies with necessary legal tools to investigate and prosecute organized criminal networks of smugglers and bring them to justice. In 2022, the law was amended to impose tougher penalties on smugglers and brokers. At the operational level, we started by doing 2 research studies on the illegal migration of Egyptian youth and unaccompanied migrant children, and this enabled us to put a map of the Egyptian governorates with the highest rate of people vulnerable to the risk of illegal migration. This also led the way to develop a decade-long national strategy to combat illegal migration. We are currently implementing the 3rd action plan, 2021-2023. Our action plans provide a solid foundation for a multidimensional response to the phenomenon based on the 4 pillars of combating the crimes. Our efforts have culminated in cracking down on illegal migration boats leaving Egypt shores since 2016. Since the establishment of NCCPIM, we were able to achieve many milestones in our combat against illegal migration. We work on the capacity building of the national prosecution and law enforcement agencies. We have now specialized criminal circuits that have been established in the courts of appeal, and a special unit on combating organized crime and illegal migration has been created in the Ministry of Interior. We recently established the Trust Fund for Combating Illegal Migration and Protecting Migrants and Witnesses, which should provide a unified financing mechanism for the National Committee and all its stakeholders, and paving the way for more consolidated programs and action plans to combat illegal migration. We work on awareness raising. We work on providing alternatives to the potential migrants. So recently, we agreed with IOM on the renovation and the update of the curriculum of the Fayoum Advanced Technical School for Hotel Management to become a school that provides students and educators with quality education to enhance their employability. We worked strongly on the protection aspect with regard to the trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants. So we established an integrated protection system for the victims of trafficking, which include a national referral mechanism that ensures victims of trafficking are not treated or punished as criminals, a designated special courts to prosecute cases of trafficking in persons and illegal migration, and we opened shelters for victims of trafficking in November 2020. In addition to all that, a hotline system was set up to receive complaints and reporting crimes of trafficking in persons. The hotline system provides all kinds of support and assistance to victims. For the smuggled migrants, we have been taking many initiatives toward the creation of a system to protect the smuggled migrants. We have a task force to strengthen the return and reintegration mechanism of Egyptian returned migrants. We are working on a task force on children on the move that include the national and international partners. The task force should examine the risks and challenges the children on the move endure in order to initiate a discussion with the national authorities to explore the possible ways to address these risks. In addition, standard operation procedures have been adopted to strengthen the interventions and services provided by the government and UN agencies to children on the move, especially children in risk. So thank you, and I hope this was useful to all the participants.
Thank you very much for this intervention. I can understand with all the work that is being done that it's difficult to stick to the allocated time, but thank you for the comprehensive overview. Let me now pass the floor on to Ms. Rita Teodorou Superman, the Member of Parliament from Cyprus, who is representing the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean. The floor is yours. But you were talking and we do not see you, hear you, just in case.
Okay.
Now you're muted.
Do you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I wish to thank the UN Migration Network for organizing this very timely event. I am pleased to be speaking on behalf of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is the deadliest migration route. Last week, another tragedy occurred yet again when a vessel managed by international traffickers capsized 50 miles off the coast of Pylos in Greece. The death toll rose to 82, with hundreds still missing. 9 Egyptians were arrested on suspicion of being human traffickers. The grave issue of smuggling of migrants in the Mediterranean continue to demand our full attention and, most important, decisive action. It is a highly organized and profitable international criminal enterprise. It represents a complex and multifaceted challenge that requires a concerted regional and global effort. To that effect, PAM welcomes and contributed to the review of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Crime, the Palermo Convention, and its 3 additional protocols, and calls upon its member parliaments to ratify the additional protocols as an opportunity to provide a more specific framework for action. Ruthless smugglers exploit the vulnerability of desperate individuals fleeing conflict, persecution, climate change, and poverty in search of safety and opportunities. Criminal organizations take advantage of the lack of legal pathways for migration. These smugglers operate with complete disregard for human life, in complete violation of any basic rule. The root causes that force people to leave their homes must be addressed in accordance with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We must work collectively to address and resolve the key drivers for migration, investing in conflict resolution, development, and sustainable solutions to create conditions that discourage and prevent irregular and unsafe migration. Each country of the Mediterranean is either a country of origin, of transit, or a country of destination. Regional cooperation is therefore needed to disrupt and dismantle the criminal networks involved in smuggling. This approach starts from intelligence sharing. PAM also encourages its member states to strengthen international cooperation and partnership, especially by intensifying joint programs and activities with entities such as the UNHCR, IOM, UNODC, OSCE, the European Parliament, the European Commission, the League of Arab States, the African Union, and the Pan-African Parliament. PAM also recalls to national parliaments and governments to provide adequate resources and training to competent authorities in order to strengthen their capacity to prevent and combat transnational organized crime, provide assistance to the victims, including through ensuring their access to justice, but also to basic services, such as public health and education, in particular for girls, boys, and women. Countries of origin should engage in dialogue between towards the conclusion of bilateral and multilateral agreements with transit and destination states for the safe return, readmission, and reintegration of smuggled migrants and victims of trafficking, whose asylum applications have been declined, with due respect to their dignity and fundamental human rights, and with respect for the laws of the country of destination. PAM supports the objectives of the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. It is necessary to create more legal pathways for migrants. And finally, PAM calls for a successful conclusion of the negotiations on the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, ensuring a balance between responsibility and solidarity, including relocation and assisted voluntary returns. PAM follows with interest the recent agreement reached at EU level, and indeed, an urgent mechanism to save lives at sea must be enforced to prevent the further loss of life without leaving the initiative to smugglers and NGOs. Last week's tragedy must not be repeated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on my list is from the Kingdom of Morocco, Sofiane Kamitri.
Thank you very much. I hope you're hearing me. Thank you. So again, thank you to the IOM for organizing such an important and timely event. Morocco acknowledges the pressing need to address the challenges posed by migrant smuggling and its linkages with trafficking in person. As a nation committed to upholding human rights and promoting international cooperation, we firmly believe in the importance of ensuring the protection and well-being of all migrants, regardless of their status. Migrant smuggling and trafficking in person are complex issues that require comprehensive and coordinated responses at both national and international levels. We recognize that no single country can effectively tackle these challenges alone, and thus emphasizes the necessity for increased collaboration and cooperation among nations. Morocco advocates for a comprehensive and balanced approach that addresses the root causes of irregular migration, such as poverty, lack of opportunities, and conflict. By addressing these underlying factors, we can create an environment that reduces the vulnerability of migrants, making them less susceptible to exploitation by smugglers and traffickers. We also underscore the importance of strengthening legal frameworks and enhancing law enforcement measures to combat migrant smuggling and trafficking. This includes robust legislation that criminalizes these activities, facilitates international cooperation in investigations and prosecutions, and ensure the effective identification and protection of victims. Morocco encourages countries to ratify and implement relevant international conventions and protocols, such as the United Nations Convention against transnational organized crime. Lastly, Morocco emphasizes the importance of a rights-based approach to migration, ensuring that the human rights of all migrants are respected, protected, and fulfilled. This includes providing access to essential services such as healthcare, education, and legal assistance, regardless of a person's migration status. Morocco stands committed to upholding the principle of non-discrimination and ensuring that migrants are treated with dignity and respect throughout their migration journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the Kingdom of Morocco, and thank you very much for the succinctness and focus of your intervention. The next speaker on my list is from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Sabine Leermakers, Senior Policy Officer. Maybe let me try again if the Kingdom of the Netherlands wants to do its intervention. That was as succinct as an intervention as possible. The next on the list then is the Maldives. Ibrahim Ashraf, who's Deputy Controller of Immigration from the Maldives. The floor is yours.
They're having connection issues.
Okay, we're catching up on time. If for the two countries that have had connection issues, please let us know if we want to be reconnected. Then let me pass on to Sierra Leone, Amadou Ba, who is the Deputy Chief Immigration Officer.
Yes, I'm here. I don't know if you can see me.
We can hear you. We don't see you, but we can hear you.
They said the host has stopped the video, so I'm not sure the host will have to resolve that.
Okay, but we can hear you, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good day all, and thank you very much for giving me the platform to share our experience on combating migrant smuggling. Australia has a long experience of this issue, given that a lot of our young people sometimes are trying to go to other countries for greener pastures, because that's one of the key drivers, the lack of opportunities at home and the lack of employment. That's driving a lot of young people wanting to go overseas, sometimes to some African countries, but mainly to the Middle East and Europe. We have an issue as well, a domestic one, whereby sometimes you get this issue within the country itself, whereby someone could smuggle someone, not necessarily smuggle, but probably traffic someone from the rural areas into the urban and mining areas. That's another area the government have been looking at. But successive government over the years have been working really hard to try and tackle the issue. This goes back to the early 2000s, whereby like in 2005, the government enacted a legislation, the anti-trafficking legislation, which was passed in 2005. That law was strengthened in 2022, just last year. And there has been some prosecution, successful prosecution under these laws. So the government has been working really hard to try and tackle the issue. And Sierra Leone is generally, we are a member of the Migration Dialogue for West Africa, which is a regional consultative body established in 2001 to encourage member states of the ECOWAS to discuss migration issues in a regional context. We are also a member of the Euro-African Dialogue on Migration and Development. I touched on the 2020, last year's 2022 human trafficking law that was passed by Parliament. It stipulates that migration is a crime and prohibits all of its forms. There are punitive measures or punitive sanctions for convicted traffickers and migrant smugglers. I think it's around 25 years imprisonment for that. So I know of one prosecution last year where the person was found guilty of it. So these are huge, these are key measures that the government has taken over the years, or successive government has taken over the years to combat the issue. However, we've been challenged a lot in this area because the lack of alignment of national migration policies within government itself. But we've been working on that. There is a task force on anti-smuggling. And that task force has been trying to coordinate all the different government agencies, all the different departments and agencies to work together in order to try and combat the issue. There is the issue about the lack of legal pathways for young people to, and that's the reason why they tend to use smugglers and traffickers to leave the country. And I think that's one area that I think our partners need to look at, see how to create more avenues for legal pathways for people to leave the country, those who want to emigrate. There is the issue around knowledge sharing and research as well. We struggle with that area a little bit. That's another area of challenge we struggle with. And because the issue around data collection is one of the key challenges we've had. The lack of equipment, it's not necessarily collecting the data itself, it's having the software and the lack of equipment in order to collect that data. And capacity building up across the board, we struggle with that as well. Those are some of the issues that we have struggled with. However, our ongoing dialogue with our international partners, as well as our neighboring countries. There is a collaboration with the Liberians, which are just across the border from us here, and the Guineans as well. We've been working very well with them to try and combat that, because sometimes some of these smugglers will not travel through the airport in Sierra Leone. What they'll do, they'll smuggle the people over across to the neighboring countries of Liberia or Guinea, to try and take the people overseas. So there has been a lot of collaboration with them around this issue. My contribution in general here is about trying to strengthen that collaboration with partner countries so that we can try and prevent migrant smuggling. The importance of developing a comprehensive, tailor-made, mutually beneficial migration partnership with key countries, in particular the country of origin, which sometimes is from our country, sometimes not necessarily from Sierra Leone as well, and the transit countries, because a lot of them do go through transit countries, mainly through the Sahara Desert to go to Europe, or sometimes across through the Red Sea to go into the Middle East. So I think it's about developing that partnership and promoting that partnership to try and combat that. The IOM, for example, that's the International Organization for Migration, has been very helpful to Sierra Leone over the years in trying to combat this issue. They've been helping us in terms, particularly around repatriation and reintegration of returnees to Sierra Leone. That's the experience we've had over the last year. I'll stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Great. Many thanks for this intervention. The floor now is with Indonesia, Kamasukaro from the Permanent Mission.
Thank you very much. Hope that I'm audible.
You are.
Okay, first of all, Indonesia would like to thank the UN Network on Migration for convening today's GCM Talk. We are of the view that prevention and mitigation of migrant smuggling, including human trafficking, have to be conducted through a comprehensive approach that also includes victim-centered approach. For Indonesia, the implementation of this victim-centered approach is reflected through, among others, providing shelters for smuggled migrants in Indonesia and also abroad via our embassies in accredited countries. At the national level, it is important to adopt a multi-stakeholder engagement and to address the root cause of irregular migration. Moreover, we would also like to highlight the importance of close cooperation between countries in managing the issues. Together with Australia, Indonesia is co-chairing Bali process. Working with countries in the region, we work to address the issues of people smuggling, human trafficking, and other related transnational crimes through policy dialogue, information sharing, and capacity building to strengthen the regional collective capacity. Against this backdrop, the Bali process has gained a wealth of experience based on its long-standing work in the region to foster connections, showcase best practices, exchange information on trends and data, and to deliver needs-based capacity building. This experience might also be useful for other processes and other regions. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing also the regional perspective on this. With this, that wraps up the member states intervention, and we have civil society intervention now specifically. We'll start with Sumita Shantinikishna from Our Journey, which I think is a recorded, it's not recorded video. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I just want to reiterate my stand. I'm also part of the working stream, and I just wanted to reiterate that we need to decriminalize smuggled migrants in some instances, and in some instances the smugglers themselves, because there are countries that are in political turmoil, civil unrest, financial, economic collapse, and there is very, very little avenue for people in these countries to leave the country if not for smugglers. So I think we need to differentiate in these kind of situations. And also, criminalizing migrants does not deter smuggling. It just pushes the operation of the smuggling into even more secrecy and it's more difficult to detect, and it becomes more lucrative. So because we work with a lot of migrants who are smuggled into the country, what we see is it's difficult for the migrants to get information or even avenues to migrate in a proper manner. So what the government needs to look at is their migration policies, the root causes as to why migrants still use the smuggling or the smugglers when there are regular routes. Is your system bureaucratic? Is it expensive? Is it cumbersome? Is it does it delay people's migration dreams? Is it discriminatory? So that's what the government needs to look at more closely. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that intervention. We have one more from civil society, actually two more. The next one is Ishan Shah, who's chair of the Migration Youth and Children Platform.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Thank you very much for the floor, Chair. It's an honor to speak at this event on behalf of MYCP, the Migration Youth and Children Platform, and we are very grateful to be part of the working group. From our end, there are a few dimensions that we are looking forward to working with you all on intergenerationally. First, of course, is to center the voices of young people, especially young women and girls, survivors and people with lived experiences, and young people facing multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, marginalization, and violence across all efforts and decision-making processes. Secondly, as has been repeatedly mentioned, we must address the root causes enabling the smuggling of migrants. We have to cling on to as a beacon of hope, but we must recognize that these are chronic structural root causes that perpetuate systems of inequalities, allowing migrant smuggling and trafficking in persons to occur. And these vulnerabilities and the prevalence are being impacted by the ongoing compounding crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and conflict. Finally, to address these root causes and to drive change, we must look at local and national implementation of human rights law and of these international standards, accounting for context. This means internationally coordinated multi-stakeholder and intergenerational partnerships, of which data sharing is an element that, as Samantha mentioned, the working group will be focusing on. This also means the sharing of best practices, mutual accountability, and the need to translate the outcomes of these various intergovernmental processes into action. We have several key processes happening this year to catalyze this action, including the Global Refugee Forum, the UN Constructive Dialogues on the review and implementation of the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. But we strongly encourage stakeholders, especially member states, not to wait for these processes to occur, because UN agencies, civil society, and youth are already providing concrete and constructive recommendations that must be implemented to ensure human rights-based approaches are adopted, promoted, and respected. We are really looking forward to working with you all more as MYCP in partnership, and many thanks for the floor.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'm turning to my colleagues. I think we have time for one more intervention, and then I'll open up again to the panelists. And the one that I have on my list here is from IOM Bangkok. And because it's an IOM colleague, I can ask you be as short as possible, and then we'll open up to the two panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello and good evening from Bangkok, Thailand. By way of introduction, my name is Jessica Dewanga, the Regional Border and Identity Solutions Officer with IOM. I would like to draw on an initiative that IOM's Immigration and Border Governance Unit implements here at the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok, called the Document Examination Support Center, or DESC. DESC is an initiative established to address irregular migration through capacity building to support law enforcement agencies in travel document examination and identity verification. And as you know, the use of fraudulent travel or identity documents frequently facilitates the smuggling of migrants, especially for criminal networks in the production and procurement of fraudulent travel documents, enabling migrant smuggling. IOM has developed in-house the Verifier Travel Document Embearer. It is a tool used at secondary inspection, which can support immigration officials in the detection of fraudulent travel documents and imposters. What is unique to this initiative is that the tool can collect data relating to fraudulent travel documents and imposter cases at various border crossing points, and can develop a regional trends analysis that supports evidence-based policymaking. verifier travel document and bearer is currently located at 56 border crossing points across Asia and the Pacific. And we're looking towards expanding a global expansion beyond this region. And this would facilitate and establish a global trends analysis platform focused on information sharing on irregular migration and transnational organized crime. Finally, just to add, DESC also serves as the secretariat of the Asian Network for Document Examination, or the ANDEX network. The network comprises of travel document examination experts of immigration agencies across 14 countries in Asia. It meets annually to discuss emerging trends and challenges related to frauds in immigration and border management. And the network supports information sharing. It raises collective awareness and facilitates regional cooperation in countering migrant smuggling and human trafficking. Thank you for allowing me to share this initiative with you today. As an example of some of the work we're doing here in Asia Pacific region, I'm happy to provide more information as needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll conclude the request for the floor. I just want to say what I've heard is both government experience, but also how they lock that government experience within more regional perspective, whether it is Asian or whether it was ECOWAS specifically. I've heard, again, discussion on definitions. I've heard discussion about travel document identification. We've had a youth perspective. We had a perspective on decriminalization, and I have forgotten some. We've also had specific perspective on the need to provide protection and support and shelter. I'd like to open the floor. Maybe, if you had one burning element, since you two are here on the panel, on top of what you've told us so far, either as a reaction to what has been said or a key message that you want to put forward. If I time you to 1 minute, what is it that you would want to be putting forward? Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm happy to go first. Thanks, Sam. I would say that the one thing that I heard, which is has to do with this conflation and this disappearance of the difference between smuggling and trafficking in certain contexts. And there's a link to a publication that LMC has been supporting recently called Captive Commodities, which look at the issue of violence exploitation in Yemen in the context of movement through the country toward the Gulf. And I heard the UN representative on trafficking speaking about the duty of rescue. So if you put together the duty of rescue, which I'm hearing, with the discourse on whether evidence exists or not, and I think that evidence exists on violation that occur in certain area. I think that it's very clearly at this point that instances of trafficking and exploitation, and if a duty of rescue exists, I think that something must be done because it's there in front of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sam?
Yeah, from my side, I think what really stood out to me was the many interventions around the non-liability of smuggled migrants, which is truly something that the protocol also protects, that indeed smuggled migrants should not be criminalized for the fact of having been smuggled. But I think because also of the diversity of perspectives, which we also respect and appreciate, there was a little bit around how smugglers should also not be criminalized. I suppose coming from an organization that is the guardian of the Smuggling of Migrants protocol, we probably can't agree. However, because there are excesses that do happen, and there has to be some kind of consequence for that. But I think what we could probably agree on is a nuanced approach to it, as we have in the paper, that it could probably, those considerations could determine how the court might deal with the person depending on the role and the nature of the conduct that happens. So this is just what I want to reinforce. Thanks.
Perfect. Before I give the floor to you, John, let me express my gratitude, both of you, for your contribution and expertise. I thought it was particularly useful to have a perspective on, the guardian of the protocol, And then at the same time, civil society is saying, well, this is what we see on the ground. These are some of the elements that we need to be addressing, including the issue of corruption and reality checks on the power of policies. Let me also thank all those who took time to join on the floor. From the floor, I wanted to say whether on-site or remotely, but all of them did it remotely. And I would encourage you to continue these conversations. And we've heard publications from Egypt coming up, and we'll try to see how we can share that report. We've heard your publication coming up. We've heard the work streams publication coming up. So we'll keep on sharing those information, because I think clearly from the numbers I'm getting of the people who stayed down up to now, there is a very strong interest in the topic specifically. Please engage, continue to engage with the UN Migration Network. The Global Compact on Migration is all of ours specifically, and we need to make it live specifically. Now, let me give the floor to John Brandolino to do the wrap up of this. As Director of the Division for Treaties Affairs at UNODC, I'm really looking forward to your closing remark and your possibly some points on the knowledge practices as well.
Thank you, Damien, and thank you to IOM for co-hosting this, for all our speakers today, both the panelists, distinguished panelists, and also our speakers from member states and civil society. Just to say that we're very pleased. Of course, UNODC we're quite engaged in these issues: trafficking in persons, smuggling of migrants. They're issues that are important parts of the Global Compact. There were, of course, many other parts, but we see them as very important. And of course, the reviews that member states that were conducted with member states and others on the implementation of the compact, we see an interest in member states on these issues, a growing interest. Unfortunately, the growing interest in smuggling of migrants doesn't always come because of good reasons. For example, some of the reasons I think why it's becoming more of a priority is, of course, the rising number of fatalities. We've talked about some of the most recent incident was discussed today. That unfortunately, there are many more like that. The number of people being smuggled. Our UNODC Smuggling of Migrants Observatory, for example, found that the number of migrant smuggling incidents on the central Mediterranean route are far higher than what was previously thought. We're also, it's becoming more well documented that the abuse that those who are being smuggled, what they suffer, as far as they're, of course, more vulnerable to many crimes, and also taking advantage by those not only who are smuggling them, but others within, in the course of their routes at their destination. We also see that the organized crime groups are getting more sophisticated in this area, and that we're seeing actually that some of these syndicates are thriving and proliferating. We see that profit estimates are on the increase. So all of these things, lead to, of course, more attention to the issue, but not necessarily for the right reasons. But that's what this dialogue in this work stream is about. It's to bring those together who have an interest in the issue, who have experience with the issue. And as you can see, it's not just member states, it's not just the UN agencies, it's those in the communities, it's those in international and regional organizations, victim organizations, in representatives of other organizations that need to come together to share all their different perspectives so we can move forward on the issue. And we really hope that the work stream, we see this as a first step. We hope the work stream will continue and that its focus for the next 2 years will be on looking at and discussing a number of issues. For example, some were discussed today, how in practice, what it means in practice to respect, protect, and promote the rights of smuggled migrants, practical solutions for addressing gaps in access to justice for migrants, challenges in upholding the principle of non-liability for smuggled migrants for criminal prosecution, and what it means in practice to follow a rights-based approach to countering migrant smuggling. And of course, deepening the understanding and exploring the complexities of going after the organized crime behind migrant smuggling, which I think is a key aspect. We're finding generally that organized crime around the world, the number of characteristics that we're seeing, and this has been confirmed on both the regional and global levels, particularly here in Europe, that they're getting more violent and deadly, that they're becoming more, the networks are becoming less hierarchical, more informal, and more difficult to detect. But there are several things that we do know about them that continue that are weak points. One is that they're motivated by profit and sometimes power. Because they're becoming more deadly and violent, there is a flow of arms and other types of things that support this violence that can be looked at to try to trace the networks. And of course, tracing the money is something that is always useful in determining what the networks are and who's involved in these networks. And actually, cyber is another issue because almost every criminal activity that happens has some cyber component these days. And so that's another aspect that we can look at to understand and to try to track down these more fluid networks. So just to say that we need to understand more about how they operate and how we may dismantle them really to end this not only this particular tragic crime, but other crimes as well. So we look forward to moving forward, and we hope that this brainstorming together, again, with everybody involved, all the stakeholders involved, will continue, and UNODC will, of course, do its part to support it. Thank you so much for inviting us here to Geneva, and we look forward to the future.
Great. And with that, the GCM talk is over. Thank you very much.